Perhaps more than ever before, the pandemic has highlighted the importance of a robust digital infrastructure. Our next guest will help us understand what the government and private sector need to do to make sure our national digital infrastructure grows to meet our needs and ambitions. Doug Brake is the Director of Broadband and Spectrum Policy at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. He also serves on the FCC's Broadband Deployment Advisory Group. That means he's powerful. Katherine Benjamin is the Deputy Chief Technology Officer for Digital Services for New York City. Very cool job. And Susie Armstrong is the SVP of Engineering at Qualcomm, one of the sponsors of today's event. She's a pioneer in bringing internet protocols to the cellular industry, resulting in the first web surfing on a cell phone. You guys all have no idea how much you owe Susie Armstrong for your distractions. Hey, it's great to be with all of you. Let's have the view on digital internet. Let me ask you, you're all digital people, and I'm wondering if we're making a mistake today in the way we've structured today's program. I talked to Congressman Rod Davis earlier, and I said, hey, when we're thinking about infrastructure, roads, waterways, air, are we missing broadband? Aren't we missing the 5D digital? And shouldn't we sort of de-silo this? Should I have, Susie on with a road guy? Should I have, Doug on with someone who can talk about, with our friend Harriet, who's rewired the way Washington thinks about this stuff? So I apologize if I've created a silo here, but let me just start off with you, Doug, and ask, are we at a point yet where, as we talk about infrastructure, things like broadband, like 5G, like data, like digital, like Internet of Things, are becoming seen as part of a legitimate part of the conversation when we think about all these other elements of infrastructure?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's increasingly obvious the broadband connectivity and wireless connectivity as well is just critical to be incorporated into infrastructure policy at large, right? Of course, broadband highlighted during the pandemic as an incredibly important tool to connect people for education, for work during this difficult period of staying at home and this pseudo quarantine that we're under. So critical that we have robust broadband networks. But as we look towards opportunities, potential for a large infrastructure package to incorporate, sensors, connectivity, ways to measure and improve the resilience and efficiency of all of our infrastructure built for the 21st century is incredibly important. So I think important to focus on broadband, and totally fair to section us off, but absolutely, as we look to the future and real opportunities around a large spending package focused on infrastructure, incredibly important that digital concerns are incorporated throughout the entire thinking of that process.
That's great. Katherine, when COVID hit, it hit before, but when we all first began taking it seriously, like in March, my weekly trips on Amtrak to New York ceased, and my daily trips to New York via Zoom sort of quintupled. And so we're writing one system less, writing another system more. And I'm interested with you as the CTO, Deputy CTO of New York City, what has that meant inside the bowels of one of the biggest city governments in America, the biggest city government in America? How has it changed your relationship with citizens, expectations, businesses, services, and are they paying you more because you become more important?
Well, the mission of the Mayor's Office of the CTO is to ensure that technology is inclusive and accessible and provides opportunity for all New Yorkers. And so in the context of COVID-19, what we're seeing is that the need for simple, seamless, and intuitive digital services has never been more important. Because as you say, we have a situation where for many New Yorkers, the way in which they engage with the world, including government, is now primarily through online or digital interfaces. So to Doug's point a moment ago, you can actually think of this as sort of a level of tiers. So in order for people to benefit from any digital service, they do need to have access to high quality and affordable broadband. So that's a huge focus for our office and a huge pillar of our work. In addition to that, though, I think it's important to talk about digital inclusion. So providing the internet, but also making sure that people know how to make use of it and use it in ways that respect their digital rights is really important. So that's also a focus for our office. And assuming you have both of those things in place, then that's where the digital services come in. And so what we're doing at the Mayor's Office of the CTO is bringing in these sort of culture, processes, and practices of the internet era the ways of working that you would see inside, a tech startup, and bringing that into government. And I think it's worth noting that it's not just the CTO in New York who's doing this. The digital government movement has been alive and thriving for many, many years. But not unlike things like telehealth providers, something like COVID-19 has now shone a spotlight on the work that's been going on in some of these exemplars around the world.
So part of what you describe, Katie, is and I may be getting it wrong, so excuse me, but a sort of software world. But it has to ride in a hardware set of platforms. Is New York City becoming a 5G city?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things we're doing is trying to build with the communities rather than for the communities when it comes to 5G. So one of the most important things when we talk about 5G is making sure that, firstly, it's safe for the millions of people who walk through the streets of New York, both residents and tourists, every year. But we're also kind of upping the expectation of what infrastructure should look like. So the Mayor's Office of the CTO is soon to be releasing the 5G Design Challenge, where we're inviting designers and architects and engineers to submit their ideas of what it should look like and how we can leverage city assets to bring in the equipment necessary to bring in next generation connectivity in New York. Thank
you for that. Susie, you're our 5G visionary here, and I have to admit, and I know that Doug is also into this in a big way, and I sort of feel, and this is my own editorial view, 5G is a really lousy name. I'd love to talk to the marketers. The lousy name for describing people, either they're so into the topic or they're so kind of like, what, But I think when it comes to the question of having a vision of what could be transformed in our lives, in our cities, in our country, in the interactivity of everything, can you give a snapshot? I know you're an engineer and not a marketer, but can you give a snapshot of what the transformative potential of 5G is?
Sure. I think the pandemic, if anything, has made us happy, if you will, that this did not happen 10 years ago. I think the networks actually survived reasonably well. But what it's also shown us, it's really hit the accelerator on the need for things like 5G, millimeter wave, that kind of speed and that kind of response time that not only connects people via their phones and their laptops and Zoom calls, but connects infrastructure, if you will. And one of the things that we're really excited about, and I'm really excited about, I would love to be on a panel with the transportation guys, because, while the pandemic has really cut down on the commute traffic here in San Diego, we do a lot more things in our cars. And there's hundreds of kids who have discovered e-bikes who are, riding around for all good reasons on the streets outside. And when you drive around San Diego in the residential areas, you really want those smart intersections, those intersections that talk to your car, the poles talk to your car so you can see, what kid or what ball is running out into the street. And so I think that's, for me, a really the real excitement of 5G. I think it's wonderful, that your videos will come down faster, et cetera. But the real excitement of 5G is how it's going to pull us out of this pandemic from a infrastructure and an economic sense. Connected transportation, connected healthcare. Every parent on the planet is all my colleagues are living the reality of home and distance learning. And while it's wonderful that most kids, not all kids, can get connected at home, I think you have things like 5G and millimeter wave that bring forth the opportunities to do augmented reality to help in learning. So these are the kinds of 5G is not just, infrastructure for connectivity. I think 5G is really significant for, as I said before, pulling us out of the pandemic economically and really making what we think of as traditional infrastructure industries, transportation and factories and such, much more resilient and better, if you will.
Susie, can I ask you a question as an engineer, and then I want to ask this of Doug too, because Doug is also, like me, a junkie for geopolitical, defense stuff. But I'm just interested, when engineers like you see the fact that you developed algorithms so that people could send photos or surf the web or find these things, or the 5G infrastructures we just heard from Lori Self was a bet that a private company was making about the future. It put substantial dollars at risk. It's a public company, rises and falls on these issues. Is there a resentment among engineers that do this, that they can fall into the world of becoming, a geopolitical pawn, and that see challenges emerge where you've got one of the most successful technologies that defines the future for many, many states, and yet you matter so much that governments are now arguing, I think, kind of carelessly and recklessly about you. But I'm just interested in how the engineering world sees it. Is that a fair question?
That's a really interesting question. And no, I don't know of, as engineers, we get really excited about this stuff, and we get really excited about not only those transportation applications that we can see, but we get excited about the uses that we can't see, the uses that the kids going into STEM are going to bring up in 5 years. Of course, we'll probably be on 6G in 10 years. So I don't see that resentment. I do see concern. Especially as we are in a very sort of, I do bring the engineering focus at Qualcomm to the policy work. And I and other engineers are very concerned that, without the right policies in place, number one, some of these technologies don't see the light of day. But
Right.
We're also very concerned about anything, and we've seen a lot of moves, anything that damps the a private company's ability to do R&D, universities to be able to do their research, because you don't have any 5G or anything else to deploy unless you have that upfront research. And that's something I'm also very involved in as you know, Steve, in our STEM work. And I get very concerned when I see education and research and R&D under attack, if you will, because you need that upfront research and you need jobs for those STEM kids, and
Right.
you need that to make America maintain its leadership in these areas. So for example, the decoupling with China conversations, if we want to get political, are of great concern to engineers who have, generally engineers, they work across the ocean, they work across national boundaries. And so I think to the engineering community, it's like with the academic community, we're quite concerned about these kinds of bifurcations in
Right.
the work and long-term R&D that we do.
I want to mention before I jump to Doug real quick that I'm very impressed with what you have done with this program called Think a Bit, which is to bring young women, communities of color into science at a really early age. So let's use the opportunity to say it's Think a Bit, right? Am I got it right?
Think a Bit Lab, and it went
Think a Bit
virtual.
Lab. Okay, well,
I think
got
we're
part
gonna
of it.
post videos on our website, and if you want an upper, you watch those videos. You will think there is hope for the world.
And I'm lucky enough that I met one of those video people in real life, so it was really fun. Doug, let me ask you a question on the other side of this, if you'd like to go that direction, which is, you've written a little bit about your concern about the discussion of nationalizing 5G. And again, through the infrastructure scaffolding lens, what are the trade-offs and hard choices that you think exist out there when you hear about what the Pentagon wants to do, when you hear about nationalizing 5G network per se? Do warning bells go off, or do you think that's something we should just hug really tightly and say, cool?
I think fair to say warning bells go off, right? I mean, to your original question, right, when you're talking about some of the geopolitical implications of 5G and the sort of race to 5G and competitiveness, especially vis-a-vis China, I do think that it's worth kind of stepping back and recognizing, don't get me wrong, 5G, incredibly important, transformative potential. But I do worry sometimes that the hype cycle, the hype around 5G has gotten so great that some within the administration, 5G has started to take on as a sort of stand-in for our technological prowess as a country overall, and has led to some, I think, really sort of panicky and poorly thought through policy proposals. I think this proposal around potential nationalization or a wholesale network falls into that group. Also, some of the efforts around export controls to stop any sales of U.S. technology to Chinese companies really aren't going to be very effective in the long term in curbing competition, and really only shoot U.S. technology providers in the foot. So I think we need a much more long-term, much more strategic vision for how we compete on 5G. It's a whole can of worms, and so I don't know if we need to get into all of it right now, but absolutely, it's a very important question.
Doug, I have to say,
thoughtful. Yeah.
I have to say that you're just such a nice guy, waving warning signs. It's like danger, Will Robinson, danger, Will. But you're so calm and smiling about it. So, but I get a sense that you think it's some serious issues. Katie, and just as we're in, the last stretch here, just real quickly, and I want to, get any of your thoughts on this, but. Knowing your background, reading your background, from working in healthcare and, hearing you about digital rights and whatever, I think I look at human capital as part of the infrastructure equation of America, as Susie was just speaking to, and digital rights and how you do this. We're at a time right now, whether because of a health crisis, and no matter what the growth rate was announced today, which was like 33%, there's a huge economic crisis that remains out there. There's a racial tension crisis in America. And one of the things that haunts me, which I mentioned early in our program today, was an interview I did years ago with Anthony Fox, who was the former mayor of Charlotte, North Carolina, and said, Steve, we made investment decisions in roads and bridges and infrastructure that cut off communities. And guess what? Those communities were divided by race. Are there opportunities in what you're doing and how you're looking at broadband and 5G to leapfrog out of that mess that we created, those biases and bigotry in the past, and create true inclusion in ways that we were unable to? Or am I naive? Will all of this continue? Will the digital divide continue to prevail? I mean, I look at the fact that I'm just wondering, do we have a big opportunity here to get things right that we got wrong before?
Yeah, we absolutely have a huge opportunity. So when you look at the areas of New York that have less strong or fewer options in terms of broadband connectivity, you won't be surprised to learn that they are areas that historically have been overlooked by big business. And when you look at the demographic profile of those areas, it's often areas that are predominantly African American or Latino. So part of what the city of New York is doing is trying to address that through a soon to be released request for proposals, which is part of our $157 million capital investment in broadband infrastructure to work towards our universal broadband agenda. And so a huge component of this is addressing those areas where digital redlining has occurred and trying to find ways to get a diversity of respondents to that RFP to come in with fresh ideas and lower cost service options to help address those areas where there's less good connectivity in the city of New York. And then I think more broadly, from the perspective of digital services, it does seem a bit pedantic, but when you talk about why user-centered design is so critical in digital service design, it's because what you're literally doing is taking the insights from interviews with everyday people and having that inform your product development cycle. And if those interviews and the people you're speaking to don't reflect the diversity of your residents or the people in that region, then you won't be surprised to discover that those products may or may not resonate with the needs of those people. So certainly there's a huge opportunity, and I'm really pleased with the way in which New York is approaching that, because I think we have an opportunity to do a tremendous amount of good.
Susie, I'm going to give you a quick thing. Doug, if you want to say anything, because Susie, I know that you're obsessed with this issue as well. So any last thoughts?
I wrote that down on RFP. I'm thinking, how does Susie from Qualcomm answer that RFP? We are not carriers. But I think what you said is really, really important. There's a lot of very good focus on bringing high-speed broadband to rural areas for precision agriculture, for underserved, underrepresented areas. But I think there is an equal there is at least an equal issue in bringing these kinds of opportunities to underrepresented populations, in urban areas, the sort of the socioeconomic gap, if you will. So I cannot agree with you more. And I think that, again, the pandemic has really showed us not only that there are geographical areas of the country that don't have good connectivity, but also that there are entire populations of students and people often of color who don't have enough connectivity to even take distance learning or work from home at home. And that's something that I think, we are trying to do our part as a company. But I also think that it requires the kind of focus that programs like this bring to it.
Thank you. Doug, final thoughts?
Sure, Steve, if I can real quickly, I do think it's important to kind of take a step back, right, and recognize the great success that our broadband networks in the U.S. had in making it through this pandemic and the great shift of work from home. We set out in a recent report on the lessons from the pandemic to look at essentially what's been a really fascinating natural experiment. I mean, sad circumstances and really unfortunate, but we did see a 20 to 40% big jump in internet traffic with around March with the stay-at-home orders, and in networks in the U.S. we saw performance degradation on average about 1%, not really noticeable. And so compared to some European nations that have a much more sort of utility style model, they had much more trouble and had to scale back some of the traffic on the networks. And so I think big picture, right, it indicates that our overall model of facilities-based competition of large companies competing to build out networks is working pretty darn well in the U.S. At the same time, obviously, pandemic exposed the real gaps of digital divide, those rural areas that don't have infrastructure, the parts of the country that see real challenges around affordability, right? We need, all Americans, low income or not, to be able to afford broadband. And so we need real policy change to be able to ensure that everyone has access to broadband. And also, I think expose, just real quickly, the need for critical services to be able to function online in time like this. Telehealth, education are real obvious examples that come to mind. So big picture, I mean, things are working pretty well, all things considered, but also recognize that there are important gaps that still need to be filled in where our competitive model just doesn't work well to address.
Sure. Well, I'm about to talk to Representative Sam Graves, who's the ranking member of House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and I'm going to force him to talk about broadband too, in addition to barges on the Missouri. So thank you all so much. Doug Brake, Director of the Broadband and Spectrum Policy Program at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, Katherine Benjamin, Deputy CTO for Digital Services in New York City, and Susie Armstrong, my favorite engineer, who's Senior Vice President of Engineering at Qualcomm. Thank you to all three of you for a great conversation. I hope you'll come back because this is cool stuff. It's the stuff I like to do. So thank you all very much.
Always an honor. Thank you.